Imaginaerum is imagination, dreams, and magic. Imaginaerum is music, poetry, and film. But more specifically is Imaginaerum a multimedia concept by the Finnish metal band Nightwish. With a concept album from 2011 and a feature film from the year after, Nightwish created a narrative that reached across multiple genres and art forms. Musically, it is primarily a certain subgenre of heavy metal called symphonic metal, due to its use of orchestra and choir to create a cinematic sound. But the band also takes inspiration from other genres like jazz and folk music. The film is in the fantasy genre, but also includes elements from horror, surrealism, and musicals. But they were hardly the first ones to create a film based on an album. Other bands, like Pink Floyd and The Who, had already during the 70s and 80s made films with stories based on their albums. These albums have been referred to as rock operas, due to their clear yet musical way of telling the narrative, similar to operas. Imaginaerum differs in this way from these earlier and well-researched examples. It is not a rock opera, since the album narrative is told in a significantly more poetic way, resulting in a more ambiguous narrative with greater room for interpretation. This completely changes the work of creating a film that both uses and further develops the themes and ideas from the music into a clear narrative. In order to increase our understanding of how the relationship between albums and films can look like, this video essay will analyze Imaginaerum in its different forms to illustrate the connection between the music, the lyrics, and the film, and how they function together to create an understanding of the overarching concept. To be clear, Imaginaerum is chosen as the subject for this purpose due to the album's unusual way of storytelling, which makes a direct film adaptation impossible, and thus its relationship to the film is less obvious compared to a rock opera. In my preparatory search for previous research, I found two texts written by Matti Karjalainen that are about Imaginaerum, one from 2014 and one from 2016. In the study from 2016, the author writes about the fan culture that has appeared among Nightwish listeners and how these people relate to, perceive, and interpret Imaginaerum's concept and narrative on the album. The somewhat older study from 2014 is more transmedia focused, since it instead attempts to understand how the Imaginaerum narrative is communicated through different media forms. However, it is incomplete from this perspective, since the author doesn't reach an answer, but keeps the question open for further research in the end. This shows that the research material is relatively unexplored and that knowledge about it is lacking. One album and film concept that I mentioned earlier and has been well researched is Pink Floyd The Wall. Kimmi Kerki, in his text from 2005, writes that the album narrative is generally more open to different interpretations than the films, and that the film is merely one interpretation, being the director's. Listeners and viewers are, according to the author, part of a circle where new interpretations affect their understanding of the works, and these mix in elements from our earlier experiences and perceptions of the real world, which creates a sort of bridge between the fictional works and reality. In chapter 4 of his book from 2015, Phil Rose also writes about this album and film. He mostly analyzes the music, but also its connections to the film, not just by looking at the lyrics, but also at how the music itself has inspired the film to certain visual adaptations. He examines the songs, notes, and chords to explain how their compositions bring about specific emotions, and then compare with the film to show how this has been carried over to visually show the characters' emotions and thoughts during the corresponding parts of the narrative. One article by Christopher Just from 2016 analyzes the concept album Quadrophenia by The Who and its related film and live show. Regarding the film, he mostly writes about the differences between the album and the film when it comes to narrative structure and the organization of the songs. He explains that film as an art form has certain dramaturgical expectations that motivate the changes in the plot, like for example the building towards a climax, and that the songs on the album that does not progress the story still are connected to the concept by describing the character's mental state during a narrative gray area. According to him, the album can be described as a psychogram rather than a story, since the songs mostly give insight into the protagonist's thoughts. This is similar to Imaginaerum in a way, since several of the songs have a vague connection to the overarching narrative, which means the album, despite being a concept album, is not a rock opera with a clear narrative. Now I'm going to present the theoretical framework that will be used as the foundation of my analysis of Imaginaerum. With this theory, I hope to break down the concept into different narrative categories, and by doing so, see how the narrative in the music and the film are similar, different, and can complement each other in a less surface-level way, in order to get a deeper understanding of the relationship between the different media products' role regarding the construction of the overarching concept. David Herman, in his book from 2009, describes 4 different categories that a narrative can be deconstructed into for analysis. These are situatedness, event sequencing, world making or world disruption, and what it's like. A narrative can include these at various degrees, but if some aspect is completely missing, one is unable to analyze the text as a narrative. This is important for me to note due to the loose and poetic way of storytelling on the album, which might make these categories hard to define on it. To help me use this theory for a transmedia purpose, I will look at how Laurie Burns interprets and uses these elements in her study from 2019, where she analyzes the album The Raven That Refused to Sing by Steven Wilson, as well as the short story and video clips that are connected to it. Herman explains that the first aspect is about the context the narrative appears in, who is telling it, why, and how. In the table by Burns, you can see that she focuses on both the fictional setting of the narrative as well as the ways it is communicated, perspective, genre, creative choices, etc. The second aspect refers to how the events in a narrative appear in a certain temporal sequence and are structured in a specific way for the purpose of the narrative. Burns also focuses on the tense used in the written text and the structure of the music, like verse, chorus, and such. The third element is about the disruptions in the story world that make the narrative worth telling. Something beyond the ordinary happens, and a part of the narrative's function is to make this, as well as the character's actions in the face of this disruption, understandable. To put it most simply, one can say that a narrative proceeds from a steady situation to a disturbance of that situation, and then to a new steady situation in the end. Here, Burns look at cause and effect, that is, how an event leads to the next, which differs from the previous sequencing of events due to its focus on the reasons behind and relations between the events. Regarding the music, she mentions the elements that disrupt its steady condition, like a vocoder that represents a certain character, or a guitar with distortion which increase the music's intensity. The fourth and final element is about how narrative represent and can give us the feeling of experiencing the events. The less a text includes the experiences of a human or human-like character, the harder it will be to interpret it as a narrative. When Burns analyzed this aspect, she mentions the emotions the characters experience, the emotions that are being evoked in the listener and viewer, and how this happens. Before I begin, you should know that the entire film will be analyzed, and so this part will include major spoilers for the story. Also, since the four elements occasionally overlap, some information will be repeated and brought up multiple times. With that said, the first category to be analyzed is situatedness. I will look at two scenes from the film and the songs Slow Love Slow and Scare Tale as examples to illustrate this aspect of the narrative. The song Slow Love Slow is musically a calm and soft song with inspirations from jazz music, which is very different from the band's usual sound. This creates a certain atmosphere, but the lyrics do not specify a setting for the song. They are written in a first-person perspective from an unknown narrator's point of view, and this narrator sings to someone equally unknown. The lyrics indicate that it's a sort of love song, but the narrator questions if this love is really true or not. In the film, the musical influences and atmosphere become related to the setting. Most of Imaginaerum takes place inside the protagonist's dream after he falls into a coma. But as the film progresses, the dream changes and takes the appearance of multiple different settings. During the Slow Love Slow scene, the dream space resembles a nightclub from the 1930s, where the song is being performed in front of the child form of the protagonist, Tom, and his daughter, Jem, who also appears as a child. The scene uses warm colors, like the red of the singer's dress, which traditionally symbolizes love and ties the scene to the lyrics. However, in the film it is still unclear who the lyrics are about, though the scene gives hints at different possibilities. If interpreted as part of the narrative, the song could potentially be about Tom's wife, but in a different scene his daughter says,
"Do you know, he'd written songs for everyone around him. Maybe even for this little bastard here. But never for my mom or me."
So another possibility is the arabesque. The arabesque figure is not just an object that means a lot to Tom, it is also important for the narrative as it symbolizes Tom's relationship with his daughter through the way it shatters and gets mended during the course of the story. The second scene and song I will use to analyze situatedness in Imaginaerum is Scare Tale. The song is in the band's usual symphonic metal genre, and as such it is heavy and very dramatic and gives the orchestra and choir a major role. It does also have quieter sections that feature children's choir and a more circus or carnival-like atmosphere with a dark and creepy undertone. There is also a circus part in the middle of the song. During this part, the lyrics specify the setting as a circus and use imagery related to this setting, but with a dark twist. The male vocalist appears to perform the role of ringmaster at the dark circus, while the female vocalist mostly sings about the fears and nightmares of a child, only referred to as you in the song. The lyrics being about childhood fears is reinforced by the children's choir at the song's intro and outro. In the film scene where Scare Tale is being played, the setting is changed to a nightmare circus, with disturbing clowns running around to scare Tom. To reinforce the atmosphere and themes of the song regarding childhood nightmares, the film uses dark lighting and cold colors, as well as a quick-paced editing and somewhat disorienting cinematography. In this case, it is easy to assume that the "you" referred to in the song is Tom, and that the lyrics are about his fears and nightmares. This is reinforced by the film story, since the previous dream scene mentions him being scared of the circus.
The circus. That's not until tomorrow. Just go to bed. What? Are you scared? How can you be scared of it if you've never even seen it? Huh?
During the scare tale scene, however, we also see his daughter Jem appearing before an old Tom in a hospital bed, like how he currently is out in the real world. She saws off the top of his head and pulls out song lyrics from it that he has written, and mocks them. This part of the scene, when connected to the theme of the song, suggests a fear of his daughter hating him due to their poor relationship. The second category to be analyzed is the event sequencing. Instead of zooming in and looking deeper at specific scenes, this aspect requires us to zoom out and get an overview of the album and film. On the surface, the film follows the same structure as the album, which is primarily indicated by the score, since the songs on the album are all adapted into the film's soundtrack in the same order as on the album, with only one exception. The exception is the song Ghost River, but it is safe to assume that a scene for this song was planned, since it has a part on the soundtrack album that is unused in the film. When looking at the music and lyrics, the structure of the album and its narrative can be described as this. The story begins with a calm intro sung in Finnish. Then a symphonic metal track where the narrator embraces imagination and fantasy. Then another metal track where they seem to be caught in a struggle between good and evil. The album moves on to a jazzy song about love, a folk metal track about nostalgia and longing for the past, a heavy and theatrical song about childhood nightmares, an Arabian-influenced instrumental track, and then a folky ballad about loss with influences from American Western music. After this, death is approaching in a track that mixes heavy metal with acoustic ballad elements, where the narrator thinks of memories from their youth as they await death. Next, the narrator is reminiscing on when they encountered various birds that symbolize different values, like love and wisdom, in a mostly acoustic ballad. Then they go on the last ride of the day in a symphonic metal song which includes theme park imagery in its lyrics to symbolize life and death. And then the next to last track is a combination of a symphonic metal song where the protagonist is dying and a spoken poem celebrating the beauty of life and the power of imagination, backed by a soft orchestral score. The last track is an instrumental medley that combines melodies from multiple songs on the album. Throughout the film, Tom is being chased by the snowman who wants to steal his memories and represents his dementia. And he simultaneously chases the memory of his daughter, Jem, neither of whom are explicitly mentioned or even referred to implicitly on the album. During the intro scene is where he falls into a coma and the dream begins. during the storytime scene, Tom hesitatingly allows the snowman to take him on an adventure. As I mentioned, there is no Ghost River scene. The Slow Love Slow scene does not progress the story further, although in the non-album scene after it, Tom encounters a memory of his father and recalls his childhood fear of the circus. The I Want My Tears Back scene takes place in the real world and focuses on why Tom's daughter Jem hates her father. Back in the dream, we have the scare tale scene and then the arabesque scene, which, despite being based on an instrumental track, is very important for the narrative. During this scene, Tom relives the memory of his father's suicide while simultaneously watching the memory of himself breaking the arabesque in front of his daughter, two events that had a big impact on his character development and his relationship with Jem. The next scene, based on Turn Loose the Mermaids, is about Tom and Jem both grieving the loss of Tom's father and the arabesque respectively, and this is where Tom begins to chase after her. The Rest Calm scene is where Tom attempts to overcome his dementia by finding and thus remembering Jem. At the same time, in the real world, Jem is starting to understand her father after discovering scattered writings containing the truth about his feelings. During the Crow, the Owl and the Dove scene, Jem pieces together her father's writings, and in the dream world, Tom begins to stand up to the snowman. The Last Ride of the Day scene is where Tom in his dream goes on a roller coaster that symbolizes his life. Along the track, he encounters flashbacks of various memories, mostly regarding his relationship with Jem. This is also the scene where he defeats the snowman. In the Song of Myself scene, Tom says goodbye to the now inanimate snowman and let himself be succumbed by the darkness of death, which awakens him from his coma and allows him a fleeting moment to say a final goodbye to Jem. Imaginaerum, the final track on the album, is played during the film's end credits. When comparing the structure of the album and the film, it is evident that they don't tell the exact same story. For example, on the album, death is approaching already during the track Rest Calm, while this doesn't happen until the Last Ride of the Day scene in the film. And like I said earlier, there are no mentions of either the snowman or Jem in the lyrics. However, there are still some thematic similarities, like how the Turn Loose the Mermaid scene, based on a song about loss, is where Tom and Jem grieve the loss of someone or something that they held dear. Or like how Last Ride of the Day, a song about theme park rides as a metaphor for life and death, is turned into a scene where Tom is riding a dilapidated roller coaster that has symbolized his life throughout the film, and dies when he reaches the end. Musically, the album is also similar to the film's structure, since tracks like Slow Love Slow, Scare Tale, and Arabesque have certain musical influences that inspired the settings, events, and atmospheres in their corresponding film scenes, which appear in the same order and place in the narrative as the album tracks. The next category is world disruption. Since the album narrative is very vague, there are not many moments of disruption in the lyrics, partially because there is no clear timeline of events or characters. Some disruptions are evident, however, like how the narrator's embracing of imagination and dreams in storytime is what begins the story, or how the approaching of death in Rest Calm is what changes the course of the album to mostly focus on the narrator dying from that point on. Musically, however, there are many moments of disruption, since the songs are very dynamic and often move between different atmospheres and levels of intensity. One example is Slow Love Slow, where the majority of the song is a soft, jazzy ballad, but towards the end an electric guitar appears that gives the song a darker and more intense feel. In the film, this is when the snowman attempts to break down the door that Tom locked, As such, the narrative intensifies together with the music. Another example is Scare Tale, where the song is divided into at least 3 different parts. 2 heavy and bombastic symphonic metal parts with a twisted circus part in between. The film scene also moves in a somewhat similar fashion, where the first metal part is the disorienting introduction to the circus, where the clowns run around and scare Tom. When the dynamic of the song changes, the pacing of the scene also slows down to focus on Jem and her mocking of his poetry. But when she eventually reads something that evokes a happy memory instead, is when the feel of the scene changes again and the second metal part begins.
Stop! That's all wrong! Don't change it!
In general, it's easy to look at cause and effect in the film, like how Tom having had multiple strokes leads to his dementia and then coma, and how defeating the snowman by letting go of the painful memory of his father allows him to awake from this before he dies. In Jem's case, it's the finding of her father's writings about her and learning about Tom's childhood that leads her to understand her father and eventually reconcile with him before it's too late. However, none of these characters or events are referenced in the lyrics on the album. The last category to be analyzed is what Herman calls what it's like. The lyrics on the album do not always detail the emotions experienced by the narrator, but in some tracks they are evident. I Want My Tears Back, for instance, is all about nostalgia and feeling a lack of excitement in life. The corresponding film scene is also focused on the past, but not with nostalgic emotions, since it's instead about Jem's childhood and why she grew up to resent her father. Though the character Anne mentions that Tom could never let go of the past.
Don't know why he had to put the bad ones up, too. He just could never let go.
So it would make sense for the song to be from his perspective. And in the song Rest Calm, which is about the narrator preparing to die, the lyrics express a longing for someone to stay with them as they pass away, but they do not mention a fear of dying. A later song on the album even mentions excitement over going on the last ride of the day, though it could be less about embracing death and more about enjoying life while it lasts. So instead of lyrics, the album often uses the musical dynamics to convey the experience of the narrative. For example, the intro track is soft and calm, which means that the metal element's introduction in storytime will have a bigger impact, to underline the excitement of beginning the adventure. Then the music shifts throughout the album according to the atmosphere and emotions of the story. Some examples are Turn Loose the Mermaids, which is a gentle acoustic ballad to evoke a sense of sorrow, but also has a hopeful undertone. And despite being about loss in a poetic way, the lyrics doesn't explicitly mention any sadness from the narrator. And then Last Ride of the Day, which the composer has explained is musically inspired by the experience of being on a roller coaster.
Then Last Ride of the Day. If any of you are roller coaster fanatics, this is really a track for you. I am, and this is totally inspired by being in a roller coaster, maybe in Disneyland or wherever.
Throughout the film, the protagonist Tom experiences and expresses many different emotions, like an early uncertainty, then a fear of the snowman, confusion about the dream, to a fear of the circus and the sadness of reliving his father's suicide. Like fear, sadness is a recurring emotion since Tom also expresses sadness when he realizes that he doesn't remember his daughter anymore, and again when he's letting go of his father. Jem also goes through an inner emotional journey during the film. She is early on portrayed as someone who hates her father and will not care if he dies. Then she experiences conflicting emotions which slowly lead to an understanding of her father and her own childhood. This allows her to embrace and forgive Tom, as well as feel sadness and grief over his death. There aren't many direct similarities between the emotions conveyed on the album and those depicted in the film, but the general emotional progression is mostly similar. A sad-sounding song is turned into a sad scene, and an up-tempo song about theme park excitement that attempts to capture the feeling of being on a roller coaster is made into an exciting, fast-paced scene with an actual roller coaster in it, for example. I have analyzed Imaginaerum by Nightwish and compared the narrative on the album and in the film with the help of David Herman's theory of the 4 different narrative elements, as well as how Laurie Burns uses and adapts his theory for a transmedia purpose, in order to understand the relationship between the album and film. The first category, situatedness, showed us that the genre and musical inspirations of the songs and the imagery portrayed in the lyrics inspired the settings of some of the corresponding film scenes, as well as certain creative choices regarding color use, lighting, cinematography, and editing. The second aspect, event sequencing, informed us that the album doesn't tell the same story as the film, but that they still share the same overarching structure due to thematic similarities between the songs and scenes, and the film's use of music adapted from the album in the same order clearly connects their structures. The third element, world disruption, showed us that the music is more important than the lyrics when it comes to inspiring the disruptive events in the film, and that the dynamic flow of the songs often tie together with the levels of intensity in the film scenes. The fourth category, what it's like, informed us that despite the few similarities between the emotions conveyed in the lyrics and those depicted in the film, the general emotional progression is mostly the same due to the film scenes often attempting to capture similar emotions as their corresponding songs on the album. Research conducted about concept albums is somewhat lacking, especially regarding those that are not rock operas. An album like Imaginaerum has a somewhat different relation to its film adaptation due to the album narrative being told in such a poetic and vague way. For example, as my analysis showed, the storytelling doesn't rely on lyrics as much as on the music itself and the use of different genres and musical ideas, which leads to a film adaptation with a very different narrative on the surface but many similarities underneath, that perhaps makes it an adaptation of the album experience more than the album's story. With this conclusion, I hope to have given the research area a slightly new way to theoretically understand and think about the possible relations between music and film within the context of album adaptations.